So first I'm going to demo the report that we'll be creating together as a group. We have a really diverse set of agencies, diverse set of experience in R. So this is a very simple report. It requires you to have 1 year of data in VectorSurv or just some data. So I'll demo that, and then there will be the bulk of what we'll do today is a hands-on portion where you will actually use R to retrieve your data from the API, create a table and a figure, output those, and then we'll walk through a couple basic things like changing colors and font sizes for the tables and figures in that report. If you had trouble downloading R, if you're not super comfortable and you just want to watch the workshop, that's okay too. I will be demoing everything on R with my screen shared, but that's up to you. After that, I'll show you some more examples of what's included in our documentation and kinds of figures and tables that you could create. We'll review the documentation that's available to you and then do a little wrap up. Let me demo what we are going to be doing today. So here's the report that you all will be creating today using your data. So this report is just going to have an output of an abundance table. You'll be able to select what species you want to show up in the table. And then we're going to output a figure that shows abundance over time weekly for this year. We'll then go back in and play around with some colors and changing some sizes or whatnot. So I do want to mention that we do have a lot of different folks here from different agencies, different lengths of time using VectorSurv. Some of you may be new, some of you may have a ton of data in the system, some of you may have no data in the system. So there is a sample data set that you can play with during this workshop if for some reason you can't access your data or you don't have any data, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so I just want to walk you through how we're going to access these resources before we actually do it as a team. So we've went ahead and created a page on our website. When you go to vectorsurv.org/resources, you will be able to access all of the resources for this workshop. Don't hit this quite yet. I want to walk through what these things do and orient everyone. So on here, this is an example of a longer report with some custom data visualizations that you can create that we'll look at later. This is just a spiel that you have all read about what we're doing here today. So all of the code and documentation for this workshop and beyond when you want to use VectorSurv functions in R can be found on GitHub. So many of you who are new to coding or R or using other software, you might not be familiar with GitHub, but stick with me. So on GitHub, this is our repository, and this is public. So these are all of the files that you will need to run these reports, and I want to walk you through those real quick. A README file is just what's showing down here. It basically explains what's in this folder. There is one .r file, and this is a source function file. This is Christina worked really hard on to write some functions. You do not need to touch this file at all. We're just simply going to load this into our report, and then R is going to know what functions we want to run. There are two RMarkdown files, and RMarkdown is a way for us to create these reports. And I'll show you the difference between R and RMarkdown in a minute. So the file that we're going to be working with today is this sample report workshop. There's also a sample report month, which I will show you. We're not going to go through that today. That requires you to have some pool data, more years of data, but you can play around with that yourself once you feel confident working with the shorter workshop report. What's going to be your best friend is this documentation PDF. When you look at this documentation PDF, and we'll go through it in more detail later, it's going to tell you everything that we're doing today and more. It's going to talk about the files. It's going to tell you how to set working directories, which we're going to talk about in a bit. In here is also all of the functions that you can run, the VectorSurv functions that Christina has written, how you can filter data, and then it's going to also walk you through how to create different tables and plots. So if this looks confusing to you now, that's okay. Read through this documentation, and I think you'll feel a lot more comfortable using R and using the functions that we've created specifically. It'll show you how to create things like these different figures, different tables, abundance anomaly figures, infection rate, and so on. So again, we're not going to create all of those together today, but once you leave this workshop, you'll be equipped to read through this documentation and be able to create these on your own. So when you go to GitHub, there is an option for you to download these files individually. For our purposes, we are not going to want to do that. We want them all in the same folder. So you can either download these directly from GitHub, or we've made it even easier. You can just click this link to download a compressed zip folder of all the files directly. I do want to mention that for folks that are familiar with R, we have this source file that has all of our functions. We're in the works of creating a VectorSurv package, so you won't actually need to load this source file into your markdowns that you're going to create your reports from. So that will be exciting, and be on the lookout for that coming. Okay, so we are going to get started with the hands-on portion of this workshop. So I am going to put this link in the chat, and you can go to this website, vectorsurv.org/resources. I would suggest that you just download the zip folder directly, and I'll show you that it's safe. I will do that on my own computer right here. It's downloaded as R workshop main zip, and I'm going to pull that to my desktop. We're going to unzip that file, and then we're just going to end up with a folder. In that folder, you'll have all those files that we saw on GitHub. And these are the files that we're going to be working with today. So what we're going to do, and please stick with me, we're going to open R. And how we're going to do that is we're just going to double click in our folder on this sample report workshop RMarkdown file. So you can watch me do that here. Here is R. If you're new to R, I just want to give you a really quick orientation. You'll see on my screen in R is mostly white. You'll notice other people that work in R, it looks different. There's abilities to set different ways that R looks and different themes. If you ever wanted to do that, I usually don't like to work on a bright white screen. You can go to Tools, Global Options, Appearance, and you can change that theme to however you want. I'm going to change it back to the default so that it's the most familiar to anyone who is new in R. But just know if you're looking at somebody else's screen and it looks like a completely different thing, it's the same thing. They just have a different theme. But we'll use this theme for today. So in R, here's our file that we just opened, the sample report workshop file. Down here is our console. This is going to tell us when things have run or if we run into errors. Over here on the bottom right is showing our files. There's different options for different views. If you want to look at what packages you have installed, if you want to look at plots you've created or whatnot. Again, this is not going to be an in-depth tutorial of how to use R, but it's going to be how to use R to create a report using your VectorSurv data. Up here, this is important, is our environment. Our environment is showing us what we have loaded into our R workspace. So this will show, as we go through here, it'll show our functions, it'll show our different data frames that we have created, and I'll show you that as we move on. So one thing I do want to show you is the difference between what an R and RMarkdown looks like, or an R file and an RMarkdown. You do not need to do this, just watch my screen for a second. When I open just this .r file, you'll see that there's one background color and it's a bunch of code in one Contrast that to the sample report file, which is an RMarkdown. We have title, author, we have different chunks here. So gray here is what's called a chunk. And each chunk there is what's going to output into our report. The nice thing about our Markdown is when we knit this file, which we will do together, and what I showed you earlier, this is what it'll knit to. On here, I can include a title, who did it. I can create the date. You can also include any text relevant to your report. So in here, we'll go through it later, but there's between chunks, you can add text. Let's say you create an abundance anomaly plot and you are creating a report for your board and you really want to highlight what happened in week 37 and you want to write a paragraph about it, you can go ahead and do that between your chunks, and it's just easy to organize. In here, we can also run individual chunks at any time, which is also helpful. And again, we will go through that. So I'm going to close that source file because you, again, do not need to touch it. If you are very experienced in R and you want to touch it, go right ahead, be our guest, but you do not need to. Okay, so we are going to get started creating our own reports. So let me orient you in our RMarkdown file here. In our RMarkdown file, we have a title. This is going to be whatever we want to write for our report. You can play around with that later. Author, date. This first chunk here is just how our chunks are going to get output when we knit. You don't need to change that. If you're interested, you can Google it. I'm not going to review that today. What's really important, our first step here, is to know what working directory we are in. So a working directory in R is a path to a folder. And this is basically telling R, get files from this folder and write files to this folder. If my working directory is set to some random folder on my computer, I'm not going to see my files here. R is not going to know where to pull my files for. So if I try to call the sample report month file from a random folder, it's going to give me an error like, I don't see that file. So you really want to make sure that you're in the right working directory, which is why I said it's nicer to just download all the files into one folder instead of downloading them individually. So what I want everyone to do is to run this get working directory line. And there's different ways for us to do that. We can click on that line and we can hit run up here. Run selected lines. It output that I'm in this folder. On my desktop, our workshop main. There's different ways to run code. I could run this whole chunk if I wanted to by clicking here. You can also click and on a Mac where I am, it's Control Enter. I think it's the same for PC, but I don't actually know. But you can run it using your keyboard shortcut or up here by clicking and highlighting a line. So everyone should have gotten an output that tells them that they are in this R workshop main folder. Now, if you're not, that's okay. There's a way for us to set a working directory. And here I want to explain something before we move on. You see, if I run this whole chunk, so if I click here to run this chunk, it's still just giving me the get working directory and nothing is being output from set working directory. And that's because I have this pound sign here. And so a pound sign in R indicates a comment, or it basically just tells R, don't run this line of code. So you can also use it to include comments. So for example, here, we're giving you some information. It's going to tell R, don't run this line of code. It's not a line of code. It's just words explaining what we're doing. But you can also use it to comment out code, and then it won't run that line of code. And that'll become important in a second when we get our data. So I'm going to uncomment this. And if I wanted to set my working directory, let's say just to my desktop, I'll go ahead and just change that. I'm going to set my working directory to my desktop. Because I'm in a chunk in RMarkdown, it's telling me this was changed inside a notebook chunk. This will be reset when the chunk is finished running. If I wanted this to set fully outside of there, I could set my working directory in my console. So you can run code also down here in your console. And now I've set, does that work? There we go. I've set my working directory. So now if I go to get my working directory again, oh, did I not set it? Weird. There we go. So I set my working directory to desktop. So you'll see here now when I hit my get working directory, I'm not, well, this is in the chunk. If I go to get my working directory on R specifically, not in my chunk, it'll say that I'm on my desktop. So if I ever tried to call a file from this folder while I'm in my working directory on my desktop, R is not going to run it. So you want to make sure that you are in your working directory, that your files you're working with in R are in. So I'm going to go back and just change this back to our workshop main so that we can run. I'm going to set my working directory back so that everything runs smoothly. So again, I'll comment this back out so I can just add that pound sign in front. This tells that chunk, don't run that. So now if I get my working directory, I'm in our workshop main. So everybody should be in our workshop main. And from there, we can move on. So before we run we compile our file, we need to load this source functions. So the source functions, I'm going to have everybody wait 1 minute. But when you run this, just watch mine. It's running a bunch of things. It's basically installing packages, loading those packages to make sure that everything will run when I call them later in my file. You'll also notice up here in my environment, all these functions just populated. So things like get abundance anomaly, get Arthur collection, get infection rate. Those will sound familiar to you. Those are very specific to us here in the vector control world. These are functions that Christina wrote in that source file that will allow you to pull those things with very few changes that you need to make to the code. Okay, so I want everyone to run this chunk. So assuming that you're in the correct working directory, I want you to run the source functions file. So you can run the chunk. For some of you, it'll take a bit longer. I already had these packages installed. So go ahead and run that. Great. So we are going to move on to retrieving our data from the API. So this next chunk, which is titled Retrieve Data from API, is going to do just that. You'll notice everything here is commented out. The reason that is because we don't want to call on the API every time that we compile this file. If we do that, it's going to take time every time connecting to the API to pull your data when you've already pulled it. So what we're going to do instead is pull your data one time. We're going to write that data to a file in your same folder so that you can keep calling that same file. Of course, when you want to next month or next week or next time you want to create a report, you're going to want to pull your data again because that's likely been updated between the time you ran your last report and this new report. So there's a comment here that says uncomment the code below and run it once. Before moving on, recomment the code. This will prevent R from retrieving your data each time you knit your file, which is what I just explained. Let me explain what's happening here. So this is telling me in my environment, create collections equals get Arthur collection. So this is a function. Yes, hold on, Stephanie, we're getting there. Get Arthur collections is a function in our source file, which will help you pull your arthropod collections. There's a couple of different things that you can do here. You can change the dates. So if I want to pull data from 2 years, 2022 to 2023, then I will run this. Before we all run it, I want to mention that there are some gateway users that have access to a lot of agencies. Say you're a state and you have access to all the different agencies in your state. If you run this without any specification of what agency you're trying to pull data from, you're going to return all of the data from every agency that you have access to. Now, for many of you, you just have access to your own agency, no problem. The amount of data that you're trying to retrieve will be relative to the amount of time it takes to pull all of that data. So say I was working for the California Department of Public Health and I had access to what's happening in one of the agencies and I wanted to just check up or create a report, or I'm interested in, say, like 3 agencies in the Central Valley and creating a report, I can just pull the data from those specific agencies. Otherwise, you can pull all the data and filter later, but just to note ahead of time. So the way that you would pull a specific agency is by putting the agency number in here. And there's an easy way to figure that out. So before we all run this, I want you in your console down here to put in the function get token. And I'll put that in the chat in case you have trouble typing it. And when I hit get token, it's going to ask me for my gateway username and password. If you do not have an account or you don't remember your username and password, just watch for now. I just want to show you what happens when I use the function get token. So for example, here, I'm going to put in gateway username and password. And what happens when I get token? It's going to give me down here what all of the numbers of the agencies I have and all of the agency codes that I have. So right now I only have access to Sacramento YOLO, which is agency 55. Say I worked for the state and I had a bunch of numbers here and a bunch of these, but I was just interested in Sacramento YOLO's data. I would put a 55 here because that is the number that correlates with that agency. And then this is telling the API, return the collections between 2022 and 2023 just for this agency. You'll notice that we had this blank when we started. You do not need to put a number there. It will run this way. So for many of you who just have access to your one agency, don't need to put anything there. But I wanted to show you this is how you can figure out what agency corresponds with which number. Great. So let's go ahead and grab our collections. I do want to point out this, if I put a random number here, it's not going to allow me to retrieve the data from this agency because I don't have access to it. So you'll only be able to put the numbers of the agencies that you actually have access to in the gateway. So I want everyone to uncomment this collections line, and then I want you to run this. And it's going to ask us for our gateway username and our gateway password. Great. If you do not know your password, you do not have one, please hold. I will tell you how to load the sample data set in a second so you can continue from here. I see some chat about that in there. Yeah, so just hold on 1 second, Stephanie. Once everyone has collected their data and we move on to loading it into R, I will tell you how to load that sample collections, which is sitting here in our folder. So I'm going to put another poll to see if folks have been able to get their data once you retrieved your data. So I was talking as I did it, but down here there was a little stop sign when I went to get my data. Here, I'm going to rerun it so you can watch. You'll see there's a stop sign here. That means that it's still working. So if you still have a stop sign there, just leave it. It's still running. Some folks might have a lot of data. Let it run. Great, so that finished. So I've pulled my collections. You'll also know that it's done when up here in our environment under data, it says collections. Okay, so we have pulled that data up into here in our environment, but this doesn't mean that this is available for use later. So if I restarted R or I rewrote something named collections, it would remove this variable. So we want to make this a permanent file that we can call on multiple times. So before we move on from this chunk, I want everyone to recomment this. Again, if you don't leave that recommented, and I'm sure somebody will, when we go to knit our file or compile our file later, it's going to try to rerun. It's going to ask you for your username and password when we really don't need that. We already have the step done of pulling our data in from the API. Okay, next we're going to move on to the next chunk. Again, this one is commented out just so we don't have to write the file every time also. So we'll uncomment that and run this chunk. And it'll tell us that we've written that to a file. And then that also means down here in our files, in our environment, and in our folder, we now have a file called collections 2223, which is what we called it here. If I wanted to call it something else, I could, but for purposes of this training, we're just calling it that. But this is how you would change the file name. If I go back to my folder for my desktop that I had downloaded, you'll also see I just wrote the CSV to this folder. So that's what we just did. Okay, so now we'll move on to pulling our file in. And here is where folks can change this to the sample data set so that you can continue working with, excuse me, continue following along. So this is telling R to read this CSV called collections 2223 into my environment. If you wanted to read a different CSV, and you'll know in this folder, there's one called sample_collections, we could pull that in. So let me go sample_collections, like that. And then I could load that file in. So I want everyone to load either the collections 2223 or the sample collections into R. So we'll run that. And once you've run that, let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to wait 1 minute to give everyone some time to process. So let's go ahead and check out that file. So up here we are in data. And it should say however many observations. This will be different for different folks that have different amounts of data in the system. It should have, let me run this one first, because this will be folks who are running their own data. It should say number of observations of this many variables. The reason the sample report one is shorter is we pulled out any of the things that you didn't need to have in here. Great. So from there, let's check out what's happening in this. So I'm going to go back and put this as the sample collections. Just, no, I'm not. Sorry. Indecisive. Okay, so we'll take a look at what this data frame looks like. So in your environment up here, under data collections, you can click that to see a view of your data frame. So this is showing me all of the collections from the last 2 years. the species, species ID, all kinds of things. I'm going to give a shout out to Sacramento YOLO, who've allowed us to use their data for training purposes. So this is not the sample data set. This is because I have access to Sacramento YOLO for training purposes to show you this. Okay, so in this column, species name, you should recognize the kind of species that you find in your district. Again, we have a diverse group of folks here from all over that you find different kinds of species. So we're going to make sure that we include the actual species that you collect in our reports before we knit them. Great. So that is what our collections look like. So moving on from there, I'm going to do this. I suggest that you just pause for 1 second and watch me do this. So when I hit knit now, my file will compile into an HTML file. So this is that data that I just pulled. And I've filtered it a little bit to just show me certain weeks, certain species. And this is coming direct from there. The reason I cautioned you to pause, if you're using the sample data set, these species will make sense to you. But if you're not, and you're from, I don't know, some other state that's not California, or a place where you have Tarsalis or Pipiens, you can change these. So I want you to do that before we knit the report. So let's go down to the next chunk. It says create abundance table. I want to explain to you what's happening here. So we're just getting our abundance. We're saying we want it weekly. These are the species that I'm interested in knowing. And this is the trap type that I want to know. For purposes right now, I want you to keep this formatting the same. There are ways later when you read our documentation, you can learn how to add multiple traps or how to filter on different things. But for this purposes right now, I want you to just change these things to things that make sense for your agency. So say I'm an agency that finds mostly Aedes aegypti, I can just write A. aegypti. And if you don't know the exact spelling or anything, a reminder that that is in our collections data frame that we have up here. So when we click that, it'll open here. We can go over to species display name, and that's exactly how you want to write it in there. So you can even copy paste straight from there. So let's say I'm interested in Aedes melanoma and Culex tarsalis, just for purposes here. Let me make sure you don't need to change that elsewhere. No. So everything that we're going to use today is calling on this get abundance function. So if you just change the species name there and a trap list, so say you don't use CO2 traps, but in here, you can use a different type of trap if you use a different thing. So once you've done that, I want you to hit knit to HTML. Once you've changed the species to things that make sense for your agency, I want you to knit that file to an HTML. Oops, where did we go? Great. So I just want to show you a couple of very basic things that we can do in here to kind of spruce it up. I know some folks had mentioned wanting to be able to change colors and sizes of things when I talked to them before. So what we're going to do first is just change the color of our line in the abundance plot. So we're going to go back to our studio, and we're going to scroll down to our abundance plot. Actually, before we do that, I forgot one thing I wanted to show you. One thing that's nice about knitting to an HTML when you use this Plotly is that these plots are interactive. So you can see when I scroll over, it'll tell me what week I am and what the abundance is for that week. When you have multiple lines, you'll be able to compare those visually. There's all of these different things that you can do. One thing that's probably the most interesting to a lot of you is being able to download this plot. So if I downloaded this plot as a PNG, I could then put it anywhere that I want. I can zoom in, I can select things, whatever you want to play with here. So that's a benefit of knitting to an HTML. If I knit to a PDF, I'm not going to have this interaction. So I actually want to show you how that changes. So you can either follow along or just watch for a second. You'll notice in the RStudio code, the last two chunks are very similar. One is commented out and one is not. This one I wrote abundance plot HTML, and this one abundance plot PDF. I'll show you if I try to knit this as a PDF, I'm going to get an error. So I got an error down here. Functions that produce HTML output found in document. So that's this plotly. Plotly is a function that can be read by HTML, and it makes those plots interactive, but it won't knit to a PDF. So if you're wanting to knit to a PDF, you could comment this out and instead uncomment this one, and then re-knit as a PDF. And it should knit this report as a PDF. So here I am. I don't know why my table and figure are switched, but I can look into that. Again, in a PDF, this is not going to be, you're not going to be able to interact with this plot. But a benefit of a PDF is, say you want to create a report for your agency and you just want to do it all in R, export as a PDF and send this out, you can do that. And you can change the formatting of this as well. One thing I want to point out is all of this text is just text that, let me show you both at the same time. This text here is text that's between chunks. So here between the chunks, I wrote text that says, I can include any text relevant to the report, such as a quick summary of what's happening. I can bold anything, and you'll see the same things are over here, and then things are italicized or bolded. And this is using Markdown, and I've included a link so that you can learn the basics of Markdown. It's very simple. You can also create specific sections. So in Markdown, if you do 2 pound symbols and then a word, it's going to make that larger. So for example, I created the section abundance, and then I included some text. You can do that anywhere else in your report if you want to include text into the report. So again, you could just create directly from RStudio whatever figures, plots, text you want, export or knit it as a PDF, and then you could have this just be your report without having to do this elsewhere. Okay, so let's go back. I'm going to go back to doing it in HTML. And I just want to show you how you can change some things. One thing I wanted to show you, you'll see here, this is using a function called ggplot. ggplot is a package that allows you to create graphics. I was just earlier, every time I use ggplot, I have to Google how you do everything in ggplot. So say I wanted to, if I didn't have these labels written here for title and why, I can look up like, add labels to ggplot, and then any of these first ones are probably going to tell you exactly how to do this in ggplot. We've done this for you. You can add labels directly here. You're not creating the plot from nothing. But say I wanted to change a line color, and nowhere in here it says anything about color. There's something about a line, but I don't know what that is. I can Google that. I came across just earlier today this beautiful cheat sheet for ggplot. So this is an example of once you get into R and you want to change how things look, if you want to change the themes so that my background looks different, I could pull in different themes. You don't need to do this. It's just visual, and it can be really helpful for communicating your data. But if you are brand new to R, stick with what's going on and then start to get into adding all of these different things. So I do know that if I want to change the line color in my ggplot, I can just add something here and change the color of my line to blue. So watch what happens when I do that. So I've changed that to blue. And then if I go to knit it, oh, I also realized I don't have to knit. If you ever, okay, never mind. That knitted the line to blue. Great. I just showed you probably the wrong way to check changes. Knitting your report every time when it's this short, super quick. I can check things this way. But if you have a really long report and you want to just check that your color worked, probably knitting it every time is not the right way to go. You can look at things just directly in the chunks in your RMarkdown. And this is something I want to show you. So say I try to run this, it's going to say object abundance not found. That is because we've been knitting this function, so it's pulling all of the things together, but I haven't actually run any of these chunks to just my local R session right now. So this depends on having abundance 2023, and I haven't actually run this abundance 2023 chunk. So I can go back and run these individually. I don't need to run that one, it's a table. And then if I go to run this plot one and then actually plot it, it'll show me in line here what changes I've made. And so that's probably the better way to do it. So say I wanted to, like, oh, I changed my line to blue, but my dots are still black and I don't love that. I could change my points also. Color goes blue, and then let's try to rerun this. And you'll see I was able to create the points to be blue as well. If I wanted this title to be much bigger, I can change the text size. Let's be crazy. So it's quite a bit bigger now. You can look up anything you want to do. So say you wanted to center this title. You can go to Google and say ggplot center title, and it'll probably return something right away that will give you the code for how to do that. So here's an example of how to do that. So you'll notice in ggplot everything is adding on to the last thing that it did. So say I wanted to add the ability for the title to go in the center, I go plus, this is the code for that. And then I want to add a plus at the end also so that it runs the next line. I just pulled this directly from Google. And then if I run it, my table title will be centered. So there's a lot of things you can do. You can change, as I mentioned, like the theme. If I want to add something, here's another, this is from that cheat sheet. If I wanted to change what the theme looked like, I don't particularly love this one, but I could change what it looks like with just very simple lines of code. And I didn't come up with these myself. I went to that cheat sheet and found, oh, that's a theme that makes the background white. And so you just added that on. So there's some simple things that you can do within tables within ggplot, and in the documentation file that Christina created and is just beautiful. This again will walk you through, I guess this is in our folder as well. This will walk you through everything we just did, and also some of those changes that you can make. And say if I wanted to change, and I'm actually interested not in what's happening weekly, but what's happening monthly, the documentation will also show you how to change things and what are the inputs that you can put, like bi-week, month. Those are all in that documentation. So you don't have to remember them. You can always reference back at that. Great. So that is the hands-on portion of this session. I do want to show you some of the other functions and code that we've written that you can plug your data into. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Let's meet back here at 15 after the hour. And I will show you some of those other things. I think everybody probably needs a 5-minute brain break. So I am just going to show you just a mock monthly report that I created. Monthly, it's just 4 weeks. Maybe don't comprise an exact month, but to show you just some of the other kinds of things that you can do with the code that we've provided. So this monthly sample report month is this RMarkdown file is in your folder and on the GitHub as well. So if you download, the reason I didn't, excuse me, the reason I didn't have you knit this file is that this relies on having more data. This file includes getting pool data. So you'll recognize a lot of the top here. We have the same source functions. This was not in our file that we just were working with. This is how you can get pools and not just get collections. So before we look at the code, I just want to show you a couple different visualizations and options for things that I did here. So you remember we had that abundance table. Here we made it a visualization. This is showing us mosquitoes per trap night for these 5 species over these 4 weeks, which is kind of a nice quick visualization to see what's happening in your agency. I'll show you, so that is here. I chose which species I wanted to go in here, knowing which ones I have in my agency, which weeks I wanted to include. And then I could change things. Oh, actually, sorry, it's this one. I could change things here. I'll run this one just for you to see. Here's another thing I should show you right now. I have some code in here like this one, and there's a table here that aren't showing up in my final report. That's because I set those chunks to not do anything. So just similar to how we could use comments to tell R not to run things, I could configure each chunk specifically. You can look up what the different ways of including and not including using the header are here, or you can just use this little settings. And so here it's telling this chunk, show nothing and don't run the code, which if I wanted to show code and output, it would show, let me just knit this again, and then it'll give you both at the same time. So this is reknitting. It'll pop up here in my HTML that I'm reknitting. Almost done. Great. So this, you'll remember I put show code and show output. So this is showing me the chunk of code. Now this might be interesting if you're trying to show somebody how to do something, but if you're creating a report, most people don't actually want to see the code. They just want to see the outputs. But what the output of that one was is just looking at the raw numbers. This is showing me sum of mosquitoes for each of those species over the weeks. Now, of course, you all work in vector control, you know, just looking at sums doesn't really mean anything because we don't know how many traps were run. So are there just lower abundance in these weeks because there's fewer mosquitoes, or did we run fewer traps or whatnot? So down here is creating that denominator of per trap night. So I'll leave that for now. You also notice these figures are different sizes. You can change figure width in each of your chunks. That's going to be up to you to do some of that customization yourself. That's base RMarkdown. So let's see, I can create different kinds of plots to show what's happening. Many of you will be familiar with the abundance anomaly calculator on the gateway. We've reproduced that here so that you can run it in R. We know that some folks have given us feedback with the calculators and the visualizations on the gateway that they want to be able to change the size of the axes or the colors or whatnot. So this is a way that you can do that. If you pull your data into R, you can create your abundance anomalies in R. So here I'm showing just what's happening at these 4 weeks because I was creating a monthly report. But if you want to show what's happening for longer than just those 4 weeks, let me figure out which one this is. This is my abundance anomaly plot. You'll notice I'm naming my chunks. It's a lot easier if you have a long report to be able to go through and figure out what they are if you do that. Or you can create a comment, and I could write like, this is the abundance anomaly plot section. And then that won't run, as we've learned that in R, when we comment things out, R is not going to run them. Anyway, so this was running my abundance anomaly for Tarsalis and Pipiens. What I did is I just changed my limits on the X and Y axis for these plots, just so that it zoomed in on this section. If I removed that, I guess I'll remove these two, and I reran this. Let me load everything so that it'll run without having to knit every time. Collections and pools. We have our abundance. This should work. So there, I took out the X and Y limits, and I'm able to produce the full plot for what happened in the whole year. Stephanie asks, how do you uncomment and comment an entire selected section? So there's keyboard shortcuts. I know they're different for Mac and for PC. So for me, if I want to select a whole section, I do Shift Command C. Yeah, Shift Command C on a Mac. But just Google it if you're on a PC, or somebody can put it in the comments. I don't know, or in the chat. I don't actually know. But there's keyboard shortcuts, so you don't have to just add and delete those individually. Good question. So if I wanted to change to be able to see the whole year, I could do that. You'll notice that for 2023, we had quite a high abundance of Tarsalis. This is what I was trying to show you. When you use Plotly, and you can change the way you look at things, this will allow me to, I don't know why it's showing twice, but allow me to show both at the same time if I wanted to hover over and compare. Let's see what else we can look at. A cool plot that Christina created was actually looking at percent change from the 5-year average. So this is something that's not on the gateway right now, but this is showing us how much increase compared to the 5-year average for those 4 weeks. And again, I could go back in and change the X and Y limits if I wanted to look at what's happening in the whole year. We have ways for you to create tables of pools. So here I just pulled from 2023, these 4 weeks, the 3 different viruses that we're testing for on a regular basis here, and it'll tell me how many are negative, how many were confirmed, totals, and then percent positive. There's also a way to highlight certain columns or certain rows. So you might be interested in always highlighting the positive or confirmed. I could change this title also to say positive instead of confirmed. That's up to you to play around with and customize. And then down here we have same as what's on the gateway with the infection rate calculator. We've reproduced that here so that you can get a point estimate as well as confidence intervals for your infection rate. Again, I could change that to be show me the whole year or show me certain parts. Can also look at vector index. You'll want to, of course, I didn't put here what virus or species or anything we're looking at. You'll want to be specific when you're creating tables or plots about what you're actually looking at. One thing I wanted to point out is that these chunks are modular. So you can move chunks around wherever they make sense in R, so long as the chunks that depend on other things come after those. So for instance, if I was creating this, if I created the chart, or I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say. If I created the actual, I did the get abundance anomaly and did the calculation up here, I couldn't run this chart above doing that calculation. So just make sure, because the way this works is when it knits, it's reading through each line of code. And if something comes before where the variable is defined or whatnot, it's going to give you an error, but it'll give you an error and you'll be able to figure out why that happened. Let's see. So that's what I wanted to show you of just some options of types of things that you could customize, different kinds of visualizations that we have code written for already that should be pretty plug and play. You'll need to change things that are relevant to your agency or what you want in the report, but you should be able to do that with the documentation that we've provided. One thing that's really beneficial to doing this is, say every month I run the same report, right? I want these exact plots in this exact order. I could just have an RMarkdown file called monthly report. And then each month I just go in here, I'm going to repull my collections and pools data, and then I'm going to knit my report, and boom, I have the same exact report that I produced last month, just with updated information. And so that's a big benefit. You don't have to go in and change anything. If you're doing the same thing every month, you can just change the text or whatnot. So I really think this is a great tool. I think this is a big win for us. You know, releasing the API was a huge win, and now creating abilities for you all to interact with your data in the API without having to be a programmer whiz, which I am not at all, I think is a huge win for us. We're really excited about this. I hope you all are excited too. And yeah, I think that will do it for my demo portion. I'll do a quick wrap up and then stick around through noon my time, the next 30 minutes, if folks have questions or want to play around. So let me stop sharing. Great. So just a quick wrap up of what we did today. So today we demonstrated how you can access your data through the VectorSurv API in R. We created a report using mosquito collection data in R. So our GitHub repo and the vectorsurv.org/resources will stay live. So you can access that code and documentation at any point. We will, the benefit of having all of our things on GitHub are that Christina and I can make some modifications, edits. If we create new visualizations or new functions, we can just update those in the documentation and in the code. So when you go to the repo or to vectorsurv.org/resources, you'll have the most up-to-date files if you download the folder. Again, we will post on vectorsurv.org/resources if we make changes. Great. So if you had any trouble today or you run into issues accessing your data, filtering your data in R, please reach out to us. We're very happy to help. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to help you review reports or create specific visualizations. We'll do our best to be available, but just letting you know what to expect. The documentation that Christina has written is very thorough and very wonderful. We encourage you to become very familiar with that. If you do run into things in the documentation that are not working for you, there's a chance that we did something wrong too. So please do let us know when you're running into issues. There's also many R resources on the internet. Anything you Google related to R will return a lot of threads, a lot of advice. So if you run into issue, Google will be your best friend. And if you want to create, I don't know, certain kinds of plots or do certain kinds of statistics, a lot of people have done a lot of things. And we really want to provide you the tools to get your data into R and do some of these basic visualizations, functions, tables, but run with it. Opportunities are pretty much endless. Anything that you want to create, feel free. We'd love to see those. If you do create your reports in R, or if you're creating things that are not in our documentation, we'd love if you sent them to us just so we could see what you're doing. I look forward to hopefully, for those in California and at our MVCAC, maybe we'll see some R figures. At AMCA, maybe we'll see some for the rest of you. So that'll be exciting for us. I do want to mention that the VectorSurv API allows you to access your data in other external software. You don't have to use R, but R is what we use today, of course. And let's see, so I think that's all I really wanted to mention today. And just to thank you all for joining us. And I really hope that this was helpful for everyone here. We are available for follow-ups, and hopefully we're planning to do some future workshops on similar topics. So I think that's all I have. I think I'll stick around. People want to work through things right now, I'll stay here. Otherwise, thank you for joining. Really appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.